Before we get underway with the webinar, though, I'd just like to say the Southwest Committee is looking for members. So if you are at all interested, then please contact the IIRSM for further information. Andy is our presenter today, and if you do have any questions for Andy as we go through this webinar, please do drop it in the Q&A box that is on the screen down on the bottom there on the Zoom. We'll monitor those as we go through. If there is anything relevant, I shall interrupt Andy and we'll ask that question as we're going along, but if not, we'll wait until the end. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Andy Farrell. He's a founder and director of Management and Safety Training Limited. So over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Simon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for turning up. It's appreciated. Yeah, as Simon said, my name is Andy Farrell. I set up Management and Safety Training about, good God, 15 years ago now, thereabouts. I'm a fellow IIRSM, chartered member of IOSH, and prior to coming into health and safety, I had quite a varied career, including law enforcement, emergency services, and so on. So I've seen a bit and done a bit. I'm getting on a bit. So I was very pleased to be asked by Simon to do this webinar. And what I wanted to do was to look at risk management in a more general term. Normally, I'll look at it from a health and safety point of view because I tend to specialise in health and safety and crisis management. But I thought I'd take a more generalist view. So that wasn't meant to happen, which I think is often a strangled cry from project managers when things fall apart. So it's real life examples of what can occur when the risk, for whatever reason, isn't managed properly. Oh, technology works. So just to misquote the 18th century poet Alexander Pope, to err is human, and then the paperwork it leaves behind can be horrendous. Okay, he didn't say that, but we all know that that is true. That if things go wrong, it can cause an awful lot of chaos and confusion, and somebody, normally the project manager, has got to try and work it all out. So what I want to do is to look at some modern examples of this erring while you're managing the projects and ensuring the chaos that can arise. So what can we do about it? Well, the examples I've chosen have been deliberately selected to represent a wide spectrum of activities. So we go from manned space flight to commercial marketing and all stations in between. So it's very broad spectrum. I'm not going to try and do a formal risk analysis of any of these activities. It may be tempting to do so, but we haven't got the space all the time, and it's not what we're looking at. We're looking at things going wrong in general. So what I want to do is to try and identify some of the factors involved in why some things went wrong and what happened because of those key failures. We won't cover every topic. It's not a deep analysis, just gives a flavour. Deliberately broad, but it's written with a common thread in mind. It's to remind those in charge of any project, whether it's safety, HR, marketing, whatever, you've got to keep your eye on the ball, because things, as we'll see, can get out of shape very, very quickly, and the failures can be expensive. So things can go wrong dramatically. So there's a lot we can look at, but I'm just going to look at a couple of the mechanisms which can lead to unwanted project outcomes, which are sometimes disastrous project outcomes. So we're going to start with a thing called the normalization of deviance. Then we'll look at assumptions, standardization problems, flawed communications, and a topic which I would refer to as the top floor effect. And I'll explain that as we get through to it. So let's look at the normalization of deviance. Now, it's not as exotic as it may sound, but that doesn't detract from its significant importance. The phrase was actually, as far as I'm aware, it was defined by an American sociologist of all people. somebody called Diane Vaughan, very respected sociologist, who came up with the idea of normalization as being the process by which deviance from correct or proper behavior or rule becomes culturally normalized. And we'll look in more detail at what she means by that. But she came up with this idea once she'd done a detailed analysis, and it was very, very detailed. The book's excellent. An analysis of why the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986 exploded. I think it was 75 seconds after takeoff. It blew up. The aircraft, the rocket was destroyed, and unfortunately, all the astronauts on board also lost their lives. They hadn't got a chance. So what went wrong? She looked at this in some detail, and she came to this idea of it was due to normalization. So how does it actually work? Well, she explained that it's a process in which a procedure, which you know it to be unsafe because you're stepping outside of approved boundaries, you're bending the rules, moving the goalposts, whatever. You're not doing what's specified. So it's technically going to be unsafe, but nevertheless, it becomes acceptable over time if it doesn't immediately cause a catastrophe. So it's almost a suck it and see approach. You bend the rule a little bit, nothing goes wrong, oh, that must be okay. And so you carry on. And that bending of the rule, that becomes normalized. It becomes accepted that that's how we do things. The main problem is the possibility that luck is involved has so far been ignored. You go for the happy belief that this must be safe because it didn't blow up my face, nobody got killed. And you're forgetting that that might simply be blind luck. And next time you may not be so lucky. Now, the space rocket is not something most people get involved in, but the cartoon shows normalization examples in an ordinary thing like a building site. And you can see them. You've got, excuse me, you've got a very obvious keep clear sign. So what happens? People park underneath because that's how we normally do things. So many days is accident, haven't bothered filling that one in. Keep the rubbish empty, nah, fill it up again. We don't worry about things like hard hats and jackets and not smoking because nothing's ever gone wrong. And this is normalization in effect. So what happened in the space shuttle? Well, they knew beforehand as part of the design, and there were many companies involved in this, but the company that made the thrusters that got the thing off the ground in the first place, they had realized there was a rubber seal involved, which would fail if it got too cold for a significant period of time prior to launch. Because what would happen, the rubber would become brittle and would fail. They knew this. They knew what the temperatures were. However, on a number of occasions, they launched anyway, knowing that the seal had been cold, the rocket had been kept in cold conditions overnight, the air temperature come right down. They dropped below the recommended minimum launch temperature, and they launched anyway, and it worked. So it was fine. So they kept on doing this, and they kept on getting away with it. So what happened was it gave them a false reassurance over time that the safe minimum temperature laid down in specification could in fact be lowered. Obviously, there's a margin of error built in and whatever, so we panicking, it's all right, it'll be okay on the night. But then the luck ran out. The seal became too brittle because of low temperature. It had been a very cold night the night before. The rocket's on the launch pad. The rubber got very, very cold, didn't have a chance to warm up properly. So it was still brittle. They launched and the seal failed, and that allowed hot exhaust gases to blow through into the fuel, and the thing blew up. The Challenger and the crew were all lost. So obviously there's a big inquiry as to what happened. It was only after the disaster when somebody went through the complete launch records as a set, that they realized what had happened. They understood why the seal had failed, and they realized, sadly, that that failure could and should have been prevented. And it was normalization that kicked in. Each individual lowering for each launch was being done to allow the launch had been minor, apparently. They tweaked it very, very slightly, will allow a little bit lower temperature. It's only a fraction of a degree. It doesn't really matter. It'll be all right on the night. And it worked. So it looked like each individual lowering was minor. But what they were doing was they were comparing the figure they were choosing now, whether this temperature would work, against the previous temperature, which had worked. And it was only a minor difference, so it'll be fine. It's only when they looked at the full records and they looked at the cumulative effect, there was error on error on error on error, they realized just how far they'd got from the original standard. Had they, instead of comparing themselves to the previous standard, had they said, we now want a temperature of X, how does that compare with the original requirement? They would have realized they were getting way off base with this, but they didn't. They made the mistake of just checking with the previous figure, not thinking about the cumulative effect. Had they gone back to keep checking with the original requirement, it would have been obvious just how far they got from the original temperature. They wouldn't have launched. Disaster would have been averted. It was human error, basically. They just didn't understand the figures. They fell into this normalization trap. And that was quite sad. So it was partly, that wasn't the only reason, because other things had gone wrong as well, but it was partly due to NASA personnel relying on this assumption that's built into normalization, this assumption that because nothing had gone wrong, then what they were doing was acceptable. And obviously it wasn't. So what do we mean by the term assumption? Well, for our purposes, what I'd say is an assumption is a belief which is firmly held, of which there's no or very little actual evidence. Now, I could be cruel at this stage and refer to a phrase such as, it's coming home, but I won't. But that's an assumption. It's a firmly held belief, but hard evidence, not so much. But people believed it. Assumptions are tempting because they offer this reassurance. But in terms of project management and safety, they can be very dangerous and they can offer as a real threat to the viability of any project. You've got to watch out for assumptions. I'll just check the chat box and we came up. There we go, that's okay. Now here's an example of an assumption at work which did lead to a major disaster. And this was the loss of the Titanic in 1912. A lot of things went wrong on that night. We know the story. Maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, hit an iceberg and sank. They've done a film about it. We know roughly what happened, but one of the issues was the ship's master relied on a key but flawed assumption about the best way to go through an ice field. They knew the ice was there. It happened every year. The very experienced mariner, but he did the wrong thing. What happened was he thought it wasn't necessary to slow down, even though they're approaching icebergs, which seems to us strange. But then again, we've got hindsight bias because we know what happened. He didn't. What later tests showed using the Olympic, which is the Titanic sister ship, that had they reduced the speed, then they would have given time to avoid the collision. Because remember, the Titanic didn't go head on into the iceberg. In fact, had it done so, it probably would have survived. But what it did do was try and get past the iceberg, ice under the water, ripped open the hull, breached too many watertight compartments, and the ship slowly sank with a great loss of life. Now, Captain Smith, let's be honest, he was a senior captain. He had some 30 years experience at sea. He wasn't an idiot. So why didn't he slow down? It's because he assumed it wasn't necessary, but he wasn't being careless. And that's not my view. That's the view of the Board of Trade Inquiry, which happened some months later. What happened was he was actually following accepted custom and practice, believe it or not. For 25 years, it seems, captains approaching the ice fields in the North Atlantic and regular occurrence. They tried not to slow down. They tried to get through the danger zone as quickly as possible. And it worked because for 25 years, nothing had gone wrong. So therefore, hey, it must be safe. It wasn't. When you look at it critically, stand back, drop all the preconceptions and look at what you're actually doing. It's got faulty logic. It's the equivalent of driving at high speed through red traffic lights on the basis that the less time you spend on the junction, then the less time there is to have an accident. And as far as it goes, that view is correct, but it's a very narrow view. Because what it doesn't take into account is the fact that if you do have an accident, and not having an accident is not guaranteed, if you do have an accident, because of the speed, it's going to be an horrendous outcome. So overall, putting both factors together, you don't do it. You stop at red lights. They never looked at the second part of that equation, as it were. If we do hit an iceberg, what happens? And for 25 years, it had worked. People just assumed that it was safe. It must be safe. They'd forgotten luck. And as we know, in the safety field, every time you conduct an unsafe act, you roll the dice. Most times you get away with it, sometimes you don't. And on this particular night, Captain Smith rolled the dice, and unfortunately, they didn't get away with it. And a lot of people, including him, lost his life. So how do you protect against this idea of assumption error? Well, I think one of the easy ways to do it is to ask yourself a simple question. How do I, or how do we know this? We're saying it's the case. How do we know? Where is the evidence for it? So look at independent, reliable sources. What do they say about the problem? But look also, and this is probably the most difficult bit, look at the underlying logic in what you're doing. Like, I'm going to travel at high speed through traffic lights. Does it really make sense? Have you looked at all the potential outcomes? Have you looked at all the factors involved? Are you making a rational judgment, a sound judgment, or is your judgment being skewed because you've forgotten to look at some factor or other? It's not easy to do that, especially if you are challenging an assumption being in place for a long time, and you may have to do that. Saying to people or to managers, actually, you can't do that. Well, of course we can't. I've done it for years. Nothing's ever gone wrong. You've now got to explain the look effect. And what I tend to do is call it the Titanic, because I think that works. But it's the problem. The longer that assumption has been in place, the more difficult it's going to be to dislodge. But you've got to try. But normalization of deviance is a very powerful effect. It takes hold slowly, but it strengthens the flawed assumption. People just take it for granted. It's going to be safe. It's bound to be. Nothing's ever gone wrong. We know what we're doing, etc., etc., etc. So be aware of assumptions. The next potential challenge to project management is standardization. Standardization is meant to help, but we're going to see that it doesn't always work that way. And I'm using the example here of Airbus in 2000. They started an international collaboration to build the A380 double-deck airliner. It's a massive size, this thing. In fact, they used them, took on a service and brought them back in again as the markets picked up. It was a complex design. It was, I think, it's the first time anybody ever tried doing a double-deck airliner, and very, very big. And just an example, the wiring harnesses, which had to be threaded to the airframe, you can sort of see them in the photograph. You see the complexity. All the wiring looms had to go through the airframe, through the nooks and crannies, behind bulkheads and so on. That actually, for each aircraft, the amount of wire involved was more than 530 kilometers. Now, I thought that that was a misprint. It's not. That is the figure. 530 kilometers of wire, 100,000 different wires running into 40,000 plus connectors. This is a big job. But they designed it and they started building it. So they got the first prototype on the floor, started putting it all together. They got the shell built, the fuselage and so on. Then they started putting the wiring in, because this thing's not a fly-by-wire system anyway, it's all computer controlled. So there's wires for everything. And suddenly they realized that all these harnesses, which have been pre-built to design specifications, had a problem, because some of the wires were simply too short. They wouldn't attach. They hadn't got enough room or length to attach to whatever they were meant to attach to. And it wasn't a situation where you could pull through a bit of slack cable. If you're not rewiring a house, not that I've ever tried it, but I wouldn't dare. Electricians will leave slack cable there looped up. So if it's not quite long enough, they can pull a bit more through and make the connection. It's fine. They couldn't do that with the aircraft. All these things were meant to be the right length, and they were pre-designed and pre-cut. The cable runs were meant to be accurate, but they weren't. The problem eventually was discovered to be different companies in the consortium that were using the same computer-aided design program to calculate the lengths and the shape of the wiring looms, but they were getting different calculations because they were using different versions of the same computer program. Now, I'm not quite certain exactly what the problem was, but this is a possible explanation. Everybody's got the same basic program, but different versions of it. So how could anything go wrong? Well, let's say, for sake of argument, that version A works showing lengths of cable to 2 decimal places. Because the calculation of the length is pure geometry. That's never going to change. It's what it does with the results. So let's assume that version A came up with results accurate to 2 decimal places. For some reason, version B will have got the same answer fundamentally, but then will display it and manipulate it based on 1 decimal place. Doesn't seem much of a difference. It's only 100,000. Can't be much. Now, let's say that a particular bend around the fuselage requires, according to calculations, 10.24 centimeters of wire to get round this corner. Okay. So version A says you need a length 10.24 centimeters long, and version B says you need a length 10.2 centimeters long. Okay. It's 4/100ths of a centimeter. It's not exactly mind-blowing. But the aircraft is big, the runs are big. Let's assume that cable has got to go around 30 bends like that. You're going to have a cumulative error, as happened with the Challenger. Error built on error. So the error accumulates. Version B's result is actually going to be short. Each time it goes around the bend, you get 0.04 centimeters shortage. You've got 30 of those bends. That gives you a shortage of 1.2 centimeters. Oh dear, it's not going to fit. That was the sort of problem which they had. I don't say that was precisely it, but I think that's basically what went wrong. The thing was, by the time they realized that not all the wires would connect to the things they were meant to connect to be technical, all the harnesses had already been installed. And we see from the photograph just how complex that operation is. So all they could do was take them out and start again, which meant they had to unbuild, if that's the word, unbuild the aircraft, take out 530 kilometers of faulty wire, design and build new harnesses, and then put them all back in the airframe and put the airframe back together. That was months of delay. In fact, one report, I've quoted the reference at the bottom there, one report suggests that at one point, over 1,000 personnel were drafted into the Toulouse plant to help deal with engineering problems. It was a major issue, but they got it going. Of course, in the interest of fairness, I've got to point out that wasn't the only problem that they had with the A380, which had significant delays and overruns, but it certainly wasn't going to help. But that was simply a mistake. Everybody used what they thought was the same program, and it was the same program, but there were minor differences the way the versions worked. And those minor versions led to cumulative errors. So I think that the caution there is to be aware of the software you're using and double check either everybody works on the same version of the same software. So if you change it, everybody gets a new version, or double check what the differences are in the versions. And some of them are quite minor, but it could be significant. Not that anything against computers, and they're quite useful, but I don't trust them. The next issue I want to look at is communications. Because obviously, when you think about risk factors, you need to think about the reactions that third parties may have to information you give them. Because you're communicating all the time and errors can occur in communications. It's bad enough if you provide the staff with misleading information, such as you make a promise about a bonus or whatever, but it never materializes, or somebody's promised a training course which doesn't appear. That's going to affect morale, that'll affect productivity. That's bad enough in itself, but that's internal. But what happens if you go outside the company? If you provide inaccurate, or some may say downright misleading information to the general public are not renowned for their sense of humor. So we'll look at a couple of cases which were caused by chief executives not really thinking about what they were saying or what they were writing. They had an idea, they thought it was a good idea, they didn't really think it through. And the first one is Gerald Ratner. Okay, this goes back to 1991. I'll show my age here because I remember it. But in '66, Gerald Ratner joined the family jewelry business. And good enough, by the '80s, he'd built it up into an international and very successful chain of jewelers. And he was the CEO. So they were high street jewelers, and they were making pots of money. Great, they were renowned for it. In '91, he was invited to give a speech to the Institute of Directors. And for some reason, best known to himself, he decided to make jokes about his products. Because they were renowned for being a high turnover company, high profit company. How could you possibly do that? And his joking response was because they sold products cheaply because they were of low quality. And in red is actually a quote from the speech he gave. We sold a pair of earrings for under £1, which was cheaper than a shrimp sandwich from M&S. Yeah, but they probably wouldn't last as long. Hilarious, rib tickling, rolls on the floor laughing. The press didn't think so, who were there at the time. They picked it up. The media ran with it, and the public were not impressed. The public did not like to think that they were being regarded as idiots by the CEO. So they walked away in droves. The effect on the group's stock, because of course the investors followed them, they didn't want to get involved either. The stock dropped by £500 million valuation. He had to resign as CEO. In fact, he brought in a new CEO, then fired him. He was left there with a lot of debt, personal debt. because he just lost a very, very well-paying job. So to cover his debts, he had to sell his stock in the Ratner Group, and over 300 stores had to close. Okay, they recovered. I think they changed their name. They were picked up by another investor. They got going again. But it was a major setback to them, and it cost him his career. He did eventually come back into the jewelry business and started to rebuild himself. But that was a very expensive exercise, all because he didn't think about what he was saying. He'd seen them using to him. It was said, obviously, tongue-in-cheek, with no malice involved, but he didn't think about the effect that would have once it was reported by the press, in effect, out of context. They wouldn't give him this full speech or how he's doing it. They would simply give a quote like that, and the public did not like it. So I think the idea is, if you're going to use humor, be careful, because it can backfire very easily. The other example is the Bulldog Brewery. More recent example, 2021. The chief exec, James Watt, launched an advertising campaign to try and draw trade. And so what he suggested was that in certain cases of Brewdog beer, if you buy it by the case, some of the cans will be, as he used the phrase, solid gold cans. Great. So people started buying them to look for these cans. Understandable. But when they found the cans, they weren't always happy. And some customers complained to the Advertising Standards Authority, the ASA, that when they found these cans, they weren't solid gold at all. They were gold plated. They felt they'd been shortchanged. And the ASA agreed with them, upheld their complaint. Now, Mr. Watt, apparently he paid compensation to the people himself out of his own money. Apparently his argument was he didn't want the company to suffer for his mistake, so he took the hit, and he was buying the cans back at the equivalent value had they been solid gold. And he claimed he'd paid out something like £470,000 to buy back gold tins which weren't actually made of gold. Okay, it was a clumsy mistake. Had he said gold colored cans or gold sprayed or gold in quotation marks, he probably would have got away with it, but he didn't. He phrased it badly. He didn't think about what he was saying or the implications of it, and people jumped on him. They felt they'd been cheated. The ASA upheld it, and it cost him a lot of money and a lot of bad publicity. So you have to think about what you're saying about your project. It's not enough to design the project. How do you tell people about it? How do you communicate it? So that's a couple of chief executives who, for one reason or another, actually spoke before putting mind in gear. But it's not just chief executives who get it wrong. What about lawyers? They can also get things wrong. You don't expect it, because lawyers are meant to be able to communicate. The words are their thing. They use them with precision. But this is an example from the USA that shows what happens when law can be badly written. So this was 2018, and drivers working for a dairy in Portland, USA, sued their employer for unpaid overtime, stretching back over years. So how could that happen? Well, I don't know why, but the situation was that under Oregon, Portland, Oregon, under Oregon state legislation, there was a restriction on overtime. And he said that overtime in the perishable food sector was not payable, for whatever reason, to workers who were involved in, and I quote, freezing, drying, marketing, storing, packing for shipment or distribution. They would not get overtime. Why? I have no idea. But that's what the law said. So the drivers, involved distribution, didn't get paid overtime. Then somebody on the driver's side studied that clause in more detail, and they filed a claim for compensation. They argued that the clause didn't apply to them because they didn't do any packing. They simply drove pre-loaded trucks. and the court agreed. They got $5 million in back pay. Okay, how could that work? It's obvious. You don't get paid. Oh, no, it's not obvious. By using those commas, you break this up into a list. So the items are freezing, drying, marketing, storing, packing for shipment or distribution. What they've done, whoever wrote the legislation initially, has lumped packing and distribution in the same phrase. It's become one continuous process, but it's not. Some people pack, some people drive. The drivers didn't do the packing. They just took out preloaded trucks. So that phrase, as written, didn't apply to them because they didn't get involved in shipment. So they were outside this agreement. The court agreed. $5 million it cost the company in back pay, all because we're missing comma. So even lawyers can get it wrong. So it can be tedious sometimes to read the small print, but it can also be profitable to do that. And then we look at what I've termed the top floor failure. Okay, so by this I mean those senior managers on the top floor, they're in charge of the company culture. These are the people, the movers and shakers, who define the company culture, which is the way things get done. They steer the company. They are the power brokers. The senior management team, the SME, are only human, believe it or not. And they can be influenced by human frailties, such as confirmation bias. And that's an effect whereby a person readily accepts information which supports their ideas, but just as readily, sadly, can ignore or minimize information which weakens those ideas. So they get an idea in their mind and they're going to go for it, and they don't want to hear things that may go against it. Also, it's been shown that many SMTs, they have a belief in setting targets to measure company performance. Now, whether the targets are valid or arbitrary or complete nonsense really makes no difference, because it came down from on high, from the top of the ivory tower, and therefore departmental managers have got to try and achieve them, pointless though they may be, even if that distracts them from managing the real issues. So the attitude of the SMT can have significant effect on how projects work, because they've got their own pet ideas. An example of this was Nokia, the phone company. One time, one of the leading mobile phone companies. But by 2013, it had dropped from the top tier and was sold off to Microsoft. Now, the French business school, INSEAD, I never know how to pronounce that. They did a project and they looked at a number of management issues. And they found that, for example, some of the top tier managers were reputation being temperamental. They didn't want to listen to bad news. So junior managers wouldn't go and tell them things they didn't want to hear because they didn't want to get punished for bringing bad news, shooting the messenger. And these managers were also more concerned about the nice things like meeting quarterly targets rather than hear bad things like there's a weakness in the system. They preferred to think about investor relations rather than how the company was actually operating. So they were looking at things from the wrong point of view. And what that suggests is something called the ostrich effect, is that reaction which the senior staff metaphorically put their heads in the sand until the problem goes away. So sit in the corner, shut your eyes, think happy thoughts, and it'll all be fine tomorrow. And it wasn't. So SMTs can get things wrong, but you need sometimes to get them on your side if you've got a problem with a project or trying to develop a new project. So how can you manage them? How can you minimize risk and get the SMT on your side? Well, this is a key topic that was addressed by two researchers, Ashford and Deter, in a paper published in January 2015 in the Harvard Business Review. What they did, they surveyed 101 experienced business managers, 77 men, 24 women, who came from a wide range of business specialisms and business sectors. So there were engineers, there were financials, marketing, HR, the whole lot at different levels, all experienced middle-level managers, knew what they were talking about, but with a lot of experience, a lot of different fields. So you got a good perspective of business in general. And what they did, they asked one half of the group to describe a time when they'd successfully pitched a business idea to the SMT, to the senior team. So it's not just dealing with a problem, but it's getting the SMT on their side. And the other half were asked to recall a time when they pitched a problem, project, whatever, but that pitch had failed. And they looked at the two to see what the common factors were. And they came up with 7 different tactics as to how you can get the SMT to work with you, to get buy-in, to use a management phrase. And a couple of examples. First of all, frame the issue. Put it into context which the boss can understand. So in other words, if you are dealing with a financial project or problem, aspect of a project, whatever, if it's financial and you're talking to the finance director, put it in financial terms. The finance director won't be that interested or understand operational requirements or safety management requirements. He understands numbers. So give it to him in a language he can understand. Explain why your concern is significant, why it requires action, but you're speaking his language, figures. Obviously, with marketing, you pitch it in a marketing context, HR, human resources context, and so on. And also consider including others. Don't necessarily go in single-handed. Maybe a collaborative approach might work. So if you are putting forward a project or got a problem with a project, then if it involves a number of different specialisms, we'll go in together. So you're talking about project management, somebody else is talking about the financial side, somebody else about the engineering side. You're giving a full picture of what's going on, and that might have more effect than just you on your own. So they're fine, they work. One thing that puzzled me was why the tactic, as they refer to them, which I think is the most effective, was actually put at the bottom of the list. And I think that was wrong, so I'm going to try and correct that now. This is the tactic. Don't just identify the problem, suggest a possible solution. And I think that is most powerful. Because you can't just go up to a manager who's going to be very busy, desk full of problems. You drop another problem on his desk, tell him happily, by the way, you've got another problem, and expect him to sort it out while you stand there and look at him. That's not going to happen. His language may not be very polite, and the odds are your problem, suggestion, wherever it is, will go at the bottom of the pile because you've got more important things to think about. It's far more important if you use empathy. This is actually a conflict management technique, showing empathy. Empathy is you understand the person's point of view, even though you may not agree with it, you understand where he's coming from, and you want to work with him. So you point out the problem, and then you suggest a potential resolution. So that shows you've got some understanding of the difficulties they face, and you're not challenging, you're not trying to make life worse, you're trying to help. So you're on his side. You're going to do this together. He makes the broad suggestions, you'll go and carry it out. You're taking some load off him. Of course, yours may not be the best solution, but it's a very helpful starting point. From a personal point of view, having done consultancy for about 15 years, I think this is something that separates real consultants like me from the wannabes, the amateurs, the inexperienced ones, because the inexperienced ones will just fall to the default position of quoting the rules. And that's not enough. The company doesn't really want to be told it's got problems. What it wants is to be told we've got a problem and there is a possible solution. And that's what good consultancy is all about, understanding the problem and working out a solution that is within the rules but will actually work. That's a personal issue. So we're almost finished. I'm going to summarize. There's one issue I haven't mentioned, which I just jotted down the last minute because I think it's relevant. Another factor to take into account. It's actually a comment was written up by a chap called Helmuth von Moltke, who was a Prussian general in the 19th century, a very successful general, who wrote a paper on tactics for the Prussian army. And what he said, and it's a phrase that a lot of people quote nowadays, is that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. He suggests that planning is a system of options rather than a rigid structure. And he's right. And you've got to bear that in mind. You've got a project, no matter how well you plan it, the odds are something will go wrong when you introduce reality to the situation. So be flexible. And that was, 19th century, it still works. So what we've seen in the presentation is that the human element is one of the major risk factors to consider. People can be complacent, they can fall into assumptions, they can trust technology when they shouldn't. They're imprecise in what they say, what they write, or they simply just don't want to face reality. Whatever. These things can come together, can lead to errors, undesired consequences, project failure. But probably the biggest risk factor you've got, which I think is what Helmuth, bless him, was referring to, was the human factor. People are unpredictable. You don't know what they're thinking or what they're going to do when outside influences affect them. So you're trying to guess what's going to happen next, and it's not always going to work. So that takes us neatly to what I term the project manager's mantra. I really should copyright that. And that is, prepare for the unexpected. Now, if it's going to go wrong, it will. There's a phrase about project management, do your plans, do your budgets, and then assume it'll take twice as long and cost twice as much. If you prepare for the unexpected, you can avoid sitting in the corner, shaking your head going, that wasn't meant to happen. Right. Well, thank you for listening. That's the end of the project, at the end of the presentation. And I shall hand over to Simon and see if any questions come in. But thank you for your attention. Simon.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. Very, very informative and very entertaining as always. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions come in just yet. We had one come in on the chat about will the recording be available, and yes, it will be on YouTube at some point in the near future. But I mean, for myself, though, there's a couple of things there, and I can relate to the standardization. I can remember an incident not so long ago where we had two contractors working on a project, and one contractor was using an older set of plans or drawings than the other one, and that caused us an issue. So very much like the Airbus situation. And the other one, dealing with the top floor as well. And I probably sit both sides of that. And you're quite right. I think but for me, the whole top floor thing is if one of my team comes to me with an issue, then I expect them to have a recommendation as to where we should have that starting point. And by the same token as well, is when you go to the top floor with an issue or a problem, is making sure that you play to the audience. I'll give you an example of that. If I was going to go and had a problem and I went to the engineering director, then he would expect facts and figures and dimensions and all the rest of it. But whereas somebody who wasn't technically minded would just want to know, well, what's the issue, and what's it going to cause us, rather than going into that finite detail. So yeah, very, very good. There was a lot of stuff there that resonated in, and it was very, very, very good. Still don't think we're going to have any questions, Andy. There's nothing in the chat either, so I'm quite happy to, unless there's any final words from yourself, Andy, I'm quite happy to end this webinar and thank everybody for being on it, Andy. So last words from you, Andy, if there is any.
No, I basically thank you for your help, and everyone needs to contact me, got some problems, ideas, whatever. Yeah, get to me through IIRSM is fine, or my own website, Management Safety Training, whichever. But no, I've enjoyed it. I hope people have got something out of it. I've enjoyed doing it. And I'll look forward to our next presentation, next webinar, next meetings, whatever. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Andy, especially for presenting this webinar this afternoon. So thank you all, and we'll be back soon. Bye bye.